Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in American history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing how far and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the year 1851, in a sprawling tobacco plantation just outside Richmond, Virginia, a series of events began to unfold that would remain buried in county records for over a century. The Sinclair estate, with its Georgian columns and sweeping willow trees, stood as a testament to Virginia prosperity. But behind its manicured facade, a psychological drama was brewing that would eventually consume everyone involved. The first peculiar detail was noted by Reverend Charles Mitchell in a parish record dated March 18th. Young Master Sinclair, absent from Sunday service for 7th week. Father claims indisposition. Yet Physician Hayes reports no calls to the estate. The Sinclair family had been fixtures in Richmond society since before the Revolution. Benjamin Sinclair, a successful tobacco merchant who had expanded into plantation ownership, was known for his shrewd business acumen and impressive collection of astronomical instruments. His wife, Margaret, had died during the birth of their second child, a son who himself did not survive beyond 3 days. This left only son Edward as heir to the Sinclair fortune. The community regarded Edward as a thoughtful young man, educated in the North and returned with progressive ideas that he wisely kept muted in public settings. According to ledgers from 1850, Benjamin had acquired several new workers for his household, including a young woman named Claire, purchased from a declining plantation in Maryland. County records describe the Sinclair home as a 3-story Georgian mansion set back from the James River with formal gardens and a separate summer kitchen. The main house contained 16 rooms, including an observatory that visitors often remarked upon for its telescope and celestial charts. The quarters for enslaved workers were positioned beyond the gardens, hidden from the main house by a grove of weeping willows. The sounds of the plantation were typical: horses in the stables, workers in the fields, and the distant bells from St. John's Church marking the hours. Yet neighbors would later tell investigators that by early spring of 1851, an unusual tension seemed to hang over the property. The first indication that something was amiss came from Benjamin himself. Entries in his business journal show increasing irritation with his son's behavior. Edward, again, absent from supper, claims studying in his chambers, though books remain untouched on observatory shelves. Another entry dated April 10th. Son requested private audience regarding estate management. Suggests preposterous changes to household arrangements. Education has filled his head with impractical notions. Must consider firmer measures. Edward Sinclair was 25 years old that spring, having returned from his studies at Yale the previous year. His father's expectations were clear: learn the family business, prepare to take over the plantation, and make an advantageous marriage to one of the daughters from allied families. The Richmond Enquirer Society pages mentioned him regularly at first, attending assemblies and dinners with the Randolphs, the Carters, and other prominent families. By February, however, his name had disappeared from such accounts. Sarah Carter, whose diary has been preserved in the Virginia Historical Society, wrote, "Young Mr. Sinclair declined invitation again, 4th time this month. Mother says old Mr. S. appears troubled, though says nothing of substance when questioned. The household staff noticed changes as well." According to later testimony from Thomas Wilson, who managed the stables, young Edward had taken to long rides alone in the early mornings, returning with his horse lathered as if from hard riding, though claiming claiming merely to have visited the far tobacco fields. The cook, a woman named Martha, who had been with the family since before Edward was born, reported to the housekeeper that the young master had been seen several times entering the summer kitchen after dark, requesting meals at odd hours. She noted particularly that he asked specifically for Claire to bring them to his quarters. Claire, according to inventory records, was approximately 21 years old. Described as educated, she was purchased to serve as a house servant, primarily attending to guests and assisting with household correspondence. The sale document noted her ability to read and write, an unusual skill that increased her purchase price significantly. Church records indicate she had been baptized on the Maryland plantation, though her parentage was listed simply as unknown. What little is known about her appearance comes from a single notation in Benjamin's records. New Acquisition C has refined appearance and manner that will impress visitors. Light complexion suggests house servant background for generations. The early summer of 1851 brought oppressive humidity to the Virginia tidewater. The Sinclair ledgers show unusually high expenditures for ice delivered from Richmond to cool the main house. During this period, Benjamin Sinclair's journal entries grow increasingly erratic and concerned. Edward refuses Carter invitation, claims fever, observed him later from observatory window, walking garden paths after midnight, troubling behavior, and later discovered personal items missing from deceased wife's trunk, confronted household staff, no admissions, cannot identify culprit. Local physician Dr. Samuel Hayes was finally called to the Sinclair estate on July 8th. His medical ledger contains a cryptic entry, summoned to B.S. Plantation, not for young master as expected, but for female house servant. Symptoms suggest nervous exhaustion, prescribed rest, removal from regular duties. Mr. S. Sr. unusually agitated about condition. Servant housed in West Wing guest chamber rather than quarters. Unusual arrangement. The summer continued with increasing tension noted by those peripheral to the household. Delivery men reported raised voices from the study. The postmaster in Richmond noted an increase in correspondence to northern cities, all in Edward's hand. A music tutor brought in to instruct the children of a neighboring plantation observed Edward and Claire in what he described as an intense conversation near the willow grove, breaking apart quickly when they realized they were being observed. The situation escalated dramatically in August. Church records show Benjamin Sinclair meeting privately with Reverend Mitchell on 4 consecutive Thursdays. The content of these meetings was never recorded, but immediately afterward, Benjamin contacted a slave trader in Richmond. Documentation shows his intention to sell Claire, despite having purchased her only months before at considerable expense. The transaction was scheduled for August 22nd, with removal to take place immediately. On the evening of August 21st, something happened at the Sinclair estate that would never be fully understood by investigators. The household ledger shows a dinner was planned with the Carter family, including their eldest daughter, Elizabeth, long considered a suitable match for Edward. The cook, Martha, had prepared an elaborate meal, and the dining room was arranged for 6 guests, yet no one from the Carter family ever arrived. According to later statements from Thomas, the stablemaster, a message arrived from the Carter plantation around 3 in the afternoon, carried by one of their workers. The message was delivered directly to Edward, who was inspecting the carriages at that time. Whatever its contents, Edward was observed reading it, then quietly walking to the main house. He requested a private audience with his father in the study. The housekeeper, Mrs. Green, reported hearing raised voices from behind the closed door. Though she couldn't distinguish the words, the tone was clearly confrontational. The argument continued for nearly an hour before Edward emerged, his face pale but composed. He went directly to his chambers and remained there until dinner time. Benjamin emerged later, instructed instructed that dinner would proceed as planned, despite the Carters' absence, and retired to the observatory with a decanter of port. The evening meal was attended only by Benjamin and Edward. Mrs. Green described the atmosphere as silent as a crypt, with neither man speaking throughout the courses. Claire was among those serving, and witnesses noted that Benjamin watched her movements with unusual intensity, while Edward kept his eyes fixed on his plate, barely touching his food. After dinner, Benjamin returned to the observatory, while Edward announced his intention to ride into Richmond on business. Thomas prepared his horse, noting that it was unusual to begin such a journey after dark. Edward departed around 7 in the evening. According to the stablemaster's account, he returned near midnight, stabled his horse himself, and entered the house through a side door rarely used by family members. What happened in the following hours has been pieced together from various accounts. The house was quiet until approximately 1 in the morning, when Mrs. Van Green was awakened by what she described as a terrible crash, as if furniture had toppled. She rose and lit a lamp, venturing downstairs to investigate. The sound had come from the observatory. Through the partially opened door, she observed Benjamin Sinclair standing beside his telescope, gripping it as if to steady himself. Before him stood Edward, his posture rigid, hands clenched at his sides. On the floor lay the contents of Benjamin's personal safe, which had been mounted behind a star chart of his late wife's favorite constellation. Among the scattered papers and valuables was a small leather-bound book that Edward held open, apparently reading aloud from it, though in a voice too low for Mrs. Green to discern the words. Whatever he read caused Benjamin to sink slowly into his chair, his face ashen. The housekeeper, frightened by the intensity of the scene, retreated to her quarters without revealing her presence. The next morning the plantation awoke to shocking news. Benjamin Sinclair had suffered what Dr. Hayes would later record as a cerebral event of sudden and catastrophic nature. He was found by the housekeeper in the observatory, still seated in his chair, unresponsive though breathing. The physician was summoned immediately, and upon examination determined that Benjamin had experienced a severe apoplexy that left him paralyzed on his left side and unable to speak. In the chaos that followed, a second discovery was made. Claire was missing from the estate. Her few possessions remained in her quarters, but she herself had vanished during the night. Edward, showing remarkable composure given his father's condition, organized the household staff to search the grounds, but no trace of her was found. The scheduled sale was obviously canceled due to both the seller's medical incapacity and the absence of the person to be sold. Edward assumed control of the household and his father's business affairs, an arrangement that would have eventually happened, but was accelerated by circumstance. He arranged for his father's care, hiring a nurse from Richmond and converting a downstairs parlor into a sick room. Benjamin Sinclair never recovered his speech or mobility. He lingered for 13 months in this condition, during which time Edward managed the plantation with unexpected efficiency. Business ledgers show that despite his youth, he navigated the complexities of tobacco markets and household management with skill that impressed even his father's most skeptical associates. Yet he made no effort to search for Claire beyond the initial day, nor did he report her disappearance to authorities. When questioned about this by Reverend Mitchell during a pastoral visit, Edward reportedly replied that she has likely found her way to family in the north, and changed the subject. In the months that followed, Edward's behavior drew continued speculation. He declined all social invitations, focusing entirely on business matters and his father's care. He began corresponding regularly with associates in New York and Philadelphia. Letters that local postmaster Henry Mason described as thick packets requiring additional postage. He ordered unusual books through Richmond merchants, titles related to property law in northern states and steamship schedules to Mediterranean ports. The most curious development occurred in October, when county records show Edward registering recording a deed for a small property on the outskirts of Richmond, purchased in the name of E.S. Trust. The property included a modest house and 3 acres of land. Neighbors reported that while the house appeared occupied, with smoke from the chimney and lamps lit at night, they never clearly saw its residents. By early 1852, rumors circulated through Richmond society about Edward Sinclair's increasingly reclusive behavior. He attended church only sporadically, declined membership in the gentlemen's clubs his father had frequented, and was seen riding alone along the canal in the early mornings, apparently deep in thought. Elizabeth Carter, once considered his likely future wife, became engaged to a plantation owner from North Carolina. The announcement in the Richmond Enquirer made a brief reference to earlier understandings having been amicably dissolved. Benjamin Sinclair died on September 12, 1852, never having spoken another word or left his sick room. The funeral was well attended by business associates and local families, though Edward himself was described as remote in his grief by those present. The will, executed without contest, left everything to Edward as expected. Within a month of his father's burial, Edward began selling portions of the family holdings, beginning with the tobacco fields furthest from the main house. In December of 1852, something extraordinary happened. Edward Sinclair announced his intention to travel to Europe for an extended period. He arranged for the plantation to be managed by his father's longtime associate, Henry Dawson, giving him limited power of attorney. The house would be maintained by a skeleton staff with Mrs. Green overseeing in his absence. The Richmond Enquirer published a brief announcement of his departure, noting, "Mr. Edward Sinclair, having settled his late father's affairs, departs next week for an extended tour of the continent. His return date remains undetermined." The article mentioned that he would sail first to Marseille, then proceed to Italy, whose mild climate is recommended for conditions of the spirit and constitution. What the newspaper did not report, but what shipping records later revealed, was that Edward Sinclair booked passage not just for himself, but for a second person listed in the ship's manifest as Mrs. E. Sinclair. No announcement of a marriage had appeared in any local paper, nor had any local minister performed such a ceremony. The mystery deepened when Thomas, the stablemaster, reported that on the night before Edward's departure, a closed carriage arrived at the Sinclair estate after dark. The driver remained with the vehicle while a female figure, heavily veiled, entered the house through the side door. The carriage departed empty 2 hours later, and the next morning Edward left for Richmond with 2 large trunks and a smaller valise, taking no servants with him despite the custom for gentlemen traveling abroad. The Sinclair estate remained under management for 6 years. During this time, Edward maintained sporadic correspondence with Henry Dawson regarding business matters, with letters arriving from various European cities, Florence, Venice, Naples, Rome. These communications, preserved in the Virginia Historical Society, focus exclusively on practical matters with no personal information beyond formal closings. In 1858, instructions arrived from Genoa with directions to sell the remaining Sinclair properties, liquidate all assets, and transfer the funds to a bank in Paris. These instructions were carried out, and the Sinclair name gradually faded from Richmond society. The most intriguing document in this case emerged in 1968, when a historian researching antebellum Virginia discovered a leather-bound journal in the university archives, apparently donated anonymously in the early 1900s. The journal belonged to Margaret Sinclair, Edward's mother, and contained entries spanning from her marriage until shortly before her death. While Most entries concerned routine matters of household management and social obligations. A series of passages dated approximately a year before her death revealed an extraordinary secret. Margaret wrote of discovering papers in her husband's study indicating that years before their marriage, Benjamin had fathered a child with a woman enslaved on a neighboring plantation. The woman died in childbirth, but the infant girl survived and was raised among the workers there. According to Margaret's journal, Benjamin had kept track of the child from a distance, occasionally inquiring about her welfare through intermediaries. The child, Margaret wrote with evident distress, had been named Claire. The final entry in Margaret's journal, written just weeks before her death, expressed her conflict about this discovery. She wrote of her intention to confront Benjamin after the birth of their second child, and to insist that he acknowledge his first daughter and provide for her future in some way that recognized her parentage. The journal ended abruptly, and whatever confrontation she planned never occurred due to her untimely death. The implications of this discovery cast the events of 1851 in a disturbing new light. The acquisition of Claire from Maryland appears to have been a fabrication, a cover story to bring Benjamin's daughter into his household without revealing her true identity. Her refined appearance and light complexion, noted in his records, take on new meaning with this context. Most significantly, the relationship that apparently developed between Edward and Claire occurred without either of them knowing they shared a father. The leather-bound book that Edward discovered in his father's safe that fateful night was almost certainly Margaret's journal. The revelation it contained, that the woman Edward had fallen in love with was his half-sister, precipitated Benjamin's stroke and set in motion the events that followed. The small property purchased under E.E.'s trust was likely a temporary safe haven for Claire after her disappearance from the main house. The veiled woman who joined Edward the night before his departure was almost certainly her. What became of Edward and Claire after they left America remains largely unknown. Italian records from 1853 show Edward Sterling and wife purchasing a modest villa near Lake Como. French banking records indicate regular withdrawals from the Sinclair funds through a solicitor in Paris until 1882, when the account became dormant. No death certificates have been located for either Edward or Claire under any known names, nor is there evidence of children. The Sinclair mansion stood empty for nearly a decade before being purchased by a family from New York who knew nothing of its history. It was destroyed during the Civil War when Union forces used it as a headquarters, leaving only the stone foundation and observatory tower standing. Today, the property is part of a commercial development outside Richmond with no marker to indicate its significance. The only physical reminder of this tragic story is a small leather journal in a university archive, its pages yellowed with age, containing secrets that destroyed one family and perhaps created another. In 1974, a researcher attempting to trace the fate of Edward and Claire discovered a curious entry in the visitor logs of a small museum in Florence. A painting had been donated in 1868 by a reclusive couple known locally as the Americans, who lived in a villa on the lake shore. The painting, still in the museum's collection, depicts a woman standing beside a willow tree, her face turned slightly away from the viewer. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows, is the silhouette of a three-story house with Georgian columns. The painting is simply titled Memoria di Casa, memory of homicide, only with the initials C.H. Perhaps some stories are never truly concluded, only transformed. The echoes of the Sinclair tragedy continue to resonate across time, a reminder of how secrets can poison generations and how the quest for freedom and love can lead people to abandon everything familiar for the chance at a new beginning. In the quiet galleries of an Italian museum, a painting watches over visitors who never suspect the American tragedy captured in its brush strokes. While in Richmond, tour guides lead groups through historic streets, recounting well-known legends, but never mentioning the merchant's son who disappeared across the ocean with his father's greatest secret. The historian who discovered Margaret Sinclair's journal, Dr. Patricia Reynolds of the University of Virginia, spent nearly 8 years attempting to piece together the complete story. Her research notes, archived at the University Library, reveal a painstaking investigation that led her from Richmond to New York, Paris, and finally to Italy. What she discovered in Italian municipal records both clarified and deepened the mystery. According to property records in the Como province, Edward and Claire, living under the name Sterling, maintained their villa until 1879. Local tax documents list Edward's occupation simply as gentleman of independent means, while Claire is recorded as artist and wife. Church records from a small Catholic congregation near their home show that they were accepted into the community, though they maintained a certain distance, never fully integrating into local society. Their neighbors described them as courteous but private, speaking Italian with American accents, and rarely discussing their life before Italy. Dr. Reynolds uncovered a particularly revealing document in the records of a local physician, Dr. Alessandro Bianchi, who attended the couple occasionally. His medical notes, written in Italian, mentioned that Signora Sterling appears to be in good health despite the burden of multiple miscarriages and a melancholy that deepens with the seasons. More significantly, Dr. Bianchi recorded a conversation with Edward Sterling during one such visit, noting, Senior explained their childlessness results from a condition that prevents healthy offspring. When pressed for details, he became reticent, saying only that some family circumstances cannot be overcome. I detect a great sorrow beneath his composure. This cryptic note suggests that Edward and Claire were aware of their blood relationship and its implications for any children they might conceive. The journal that revealed their shared parentage had apparently provided enough information for them to understand the biological risks of their union, leading to their apparent decision to remain childless despite multiple pregnancies. The Sterling's life in Italy seems to have been comfortable but measured. They traveled occasionally to Venice and Milan, according to passport records, but always returned to their lakeside villa. Local records show they purchased additional property adjacent to their home in 1872, expanding their gardens and adding a small studio where, according to neighbors' accounts, Claire painted landscapes and portraits that were occasionally exhibited in local galleries. In 1879, something changed in the Sterling circumstances. Property records show the villa being sold to a German industrialist, and the couple disappears from Italian records. Banking documents from Paris show the Sterling account receiving a large deposit that year, presumably from the property sale, followed by the establishment of a new account at a bank in Provence, France. Dr. Reynolds followed this trail to southern France, where she found records of an American couple purchasing a small lavender farm outside Avignon in early 1880. The names on the deed were Edward and Catherine Sterling. The description in the property records matches Claire, wife of American nationality, approximately 50 years of age, light complexion. The couple seemed to have sought even greater privacy in this rural French setting, further removed from the society they had left behind. The most poignant discovery in Dr. Reynolds' research came from the archives of a small church near the Sterling property in France. In 1882, the parish recorded the death of Edward Sterling, aged 56, from pneumonia following a winter illness. His wife Catherine arranged for his burial in the church cemetery, where his gravestone, weathered but still legible when Dr. Reynolds visited, bears the simple inscription, Edward S., born of one world, found peace in another. mother. What became of Claire after Edward's death remains partially obscured. French property records show she maintained ownership of the farm for another 12 years, living there alone, according to tax documents. Local memory recorded by Dr. Reynolds in interviews with elderly residents described L'Américaine, the American woman, as a quiet widow who painted and tended her lavender fields, occasionally selling small landscapes to visitors from Avignon. In 1894, the property was sold to a French family, and Catherine Sterling vanishes from official records. However, Dr. Reynolds discovered a tantalizing detail in the archives of a women's boarding house in Paris. A register entry from December 1894 lists C. Sterling, American widow, age approximately 64, taking up residence. The boarding house catered to genteel women of modest means, particularly artists and writers seeking affordable accommodations in the city. From there, the trail grows cold. No death certificate for Catherine or Claire Sterling has been found in Parisian records. The boarding house's documentation ends in 1899 when the establishment closed. A final intriguing possibility emerged from passenger manifests of ships sailing from Le Havre to Boston in 1896. Mrs. C. Sterling is listed among the second-class passengers. Her age given as 66, her previous residence as France. Whether this was Claire returning to America after more than 40 years of exile remains unconfirmed. Dr. Reynolds's research notes conclude with a reflection on the limitations of historical investigation. Some lives deliberately step away from documentation, seeking the freedom that comes with semi-anonymity. The Sterlings, or the Sinclairs as they were born, seem to have chosen this path, leaving just enough traces to confirm their existence, but insufficient evidence to fully illuminate their inner lives. Perhaps this was their final act of self-determination, to control not only how they lived, but how they would be remembered or forgotten. The mystery might have remained in academic obscurity had it not been for an unusual discovery. In 1971, during the renovation of an old townhouse in Philadelphia's Society Hill, workers discovered a hidden compartment in the attic wall containing a tin box. Inside were several items: a small leather-bound book with blank pages, except for the inscription "To C from E. Remember only what brings peace," a pressed willow leaf, a daguerreotype of a young man in formal attire, presumably Edward, and most significantly, several letters. The letters, dated 1897 through 1900, were addressed to my dearest friend and signed simply C. They were written from a boarding house in Philadelphia's Chestnut Hill to someone identified only as L, apparently a woman who had befriended the writer. The contents suggest an elderly woman reflecting on her extraordinary life while maintaining careful discretion about specific details. In one letter dated March 1898, she writes, "You ask why I returned to America after so many years abroad. Perhaps it was a desire to complete the circle, to end where I began, though not in the same place or circumstance. The South holds no appeal. Too many ghosts walk those gardens. But here, where autumn colors the streets and winter brings silence, I find a strange comfort. No one looks twice at an elderly widow who keeps to herself, and that anonymity is its own kind of freedom." Another letter from November that same year offers the most direct reference to her past. "L, your curiosity about my life before Europe is natural, but cannot be satisfied. Some stories cannot be told, even after all principles have passed from this world. What you perceive as romance was also tragedy, and what seemed like escape was also exile. Know only that I loved completely a man who sacrificed everything worldly for my sake, and I for his. Whatever judgment might fall upon us, we answered to our own hearts first, and found that sufficient. The final letter in the collection, dated May 1900, takes on the tone of a farewell. My health fails with the warming season. The doctor makes reassuring sounds, but his eyes tell a different story. I am not afraid. I have lived a life so far beyond what was intended for me that each day has been an unexpected gift. The paintings I have given you are my legacy, not for their modest artistic merit, but for the memories they contain: the willow grove, the lake at twilight, the lavender fields in morning light. Each holds a chapter of a story I could never write in words. No record exists of Claire's death in Philadelphia City records under the name Sterling, suggesting she may have adopted yet another identity in her final years, or perhaps passed away elsewhere. The townhouse where the letters were discovered had changed ownership numerous times since the 1900s, making it impossible to identify Elle or determine how the letters came to be hidden in the wall. The Sinclair Sterling story might have remained largely unknown had Dr. Reynolds not published a small monograph on her findings in 1975 titled Across Boundaries: The Exile of Edward and Claire. The limited academic publication caught the attention of a filmmaker researching antebellum Virginia, who adapted elements of the story into a documentary in 1978. Though some details were dramatized for narrative flow, the documentary brought attention to the original research, leading to renewed interest in the actual historical figures. In 1984, a descendant of Henry Dawson, who had managed the Sinclair plantation during Edward's absence, discovered additional correspondence in a family archive. These letters, exchanged between Dawson and Edward during the early years in Italy, revealed that Dawson had been aware of the true nature of Edward and Claire's relationship, and had helped facilitate their escape from Richmond. His assistance had been motivated by a deathbed promise to Margaret Sinclair, who had apparently entrusted him with her journal and asked him to help her children should the truth ever come to light. The most haunting artifact associated with this story remains the painting in the Florence Museum. Art historians who have examined it note that while the technique is that of a talented amateur rather than a trained artist, the emotional quality of the work is remarkable. The woman's posture facing away from the plantation house while still acknowledging its presence captures the fundamental tension of Claire's existence. She is simultaneously connected to and alienated from her birthplace, bound to it by blood, yet excluded from its privileges. Visitors to the museum who know nothing of the painting's origins often comment on its melancholy atmosphere, the sense of something precious and painful captured in oil and canvas. The story it tells without words is one of impossible choices, of identities constructed and abandoned, of the price paid for autonomy and love. In that sense, Memoria di Casa serves as both art and artifact, a visual testimony to lives that official history would have erased entirely. What remains unclear and perhaps unknowable is when Edward and Claire discovered the nature of their relationship. Did they learn they were half-siblings before or after their feelings for each other developed? Did that knowledge cause them to resist their attraction initially, only to succumb later? Or did they make peace with their unusual circumstances, reasoning that a society that had already denied Claire's humanity had no moral authority over their hearts? The journal entries, letters, and documents provide no definitive answer to these questions. What they do reveal is that whatever moral calculations the couple made, they committed to their decision completely, abandoning wealth, status, and homeland, rather than separating. Their chosen exile speaks to both the power of their bond and the impossibility of maintaining it within the social framework of 19th century America. The story of Edward and Claire exists in the liminal spaces of historical record, emerging in fragments from ships' manifests, property deeds, medical notes, and personal correspondence. It challenges conventional narratives about antebellum plantation life, suggesting complexities and connections that official histories often obscured. Most significantly, it demonstrates how individual lives could defy the rigid categories imposed by society, seeking personal truth at enormous cost. In 1988, a final discovery added a coda to their story. A small museum in Philadelphia acquired a collection of paintings from a private estate, including several attributed to C.H. One canvas, smaller than the others and apparently unfinished, depicts two figures walking away from the viewer along a tree-lined path. Their faces are not visible, but their posture, an older man leaning slightly on a woman's arm as they walk, suggests both intimacy and interdependence. The background shows mountains that art historians have identified as resembling the landscape near Avignon. The painting bears no title on its frame, but on the back, written in faded pencil, are three words: the path chosen. The Sinclair story faded again from public awareness by the 1990s, remembered primarily by academic specialists in antebellum history, yet it continues to surface occasionally in unexpected contexts. A footnote in studies of plantation households, a reference point in examinations of racial identity in the American South, a case study in research methodology courses demonstrating how fragmentary evidence can be assembled into historical narrative. Perhaps the most fitting memorial to Edward and Claire came in 2011 when the University of Virginia established a digital archive dedicated to alternative family structures in antebellum America. The Sinclair Sterling documents form the centerpiece of this collection, with Margaret's journal, Edward's business correspondence, and images of Claire's paintings made available to researchers worldwide. The archive's introduction acknowledges that while their story is exceptional, it points to broader truths about how individuals navigated, resisted, and sometimes transcended the rigid social boundaries of their time. In the quiet reading rooms of archives from Richmond to Florence, in the digital databases of universities, and in the memories of those who have encountered their story, Edward and Claire continue to exist not as historical curiosities or romantic legends, but as human beings who made difficult choices in impossible circumstances. Their story reminds us that beneath the broad strokes of historical movements and social systems, individual lives unfold with complexity, contradiction, and courage that records can only partially capture. The sound of their footsteps along Italian lake shores and Provencal lavender fields has long since faded. The hands that wrote those letters and painted those canvases have returned to dust. Yet something essential remains: the testimony of lives determined to define themselves rather than be defined by others, to find connection across boundaries designed to separate, and to create meaning in a world that denied their right to exist as equals. In that testimony lies both their tragedy and their triumph.